A Scholar's Adventures in the Country by Harriet Beecher Stowe. If we could only live in the country, said my wife, how much easier it would be to live. And how much cheaper, said I. To have a little place of our own and raise our own things, said my wife. Dear me, I am heartsick when I think of the old place at home and father's great garden. What peaches and melons we used to have, what greens, peas, and corn. Now one has to buy every cent's worth of these things, and how they taste. Such wilted, miserable corn, such peas. Then, if we lived in the country, we should have our own cow, and milk and cream in abundance, our own hens and chickens. We could have custard and ice cream every day, to say nothing of the trees and flowers and all that, said I. The result of this little domestic duet was that my wife and I began to ride about the city to look up some pretty interesting cottage, where our visions of rural bliss might be realized. Country residences near the city we found to bear rather a high price, so that it was no easy matter to find a situation suitable to the length of our purse, till at last a judicious friend suggested a happy expedient. Borrow a few hundred, he said, and give your note. You can save enough very soon to make the difference, and when you raise everything you eat, you know it will make your salary go a wonderful deal further. Certainly it will, I said. And what can be more beautiful than to buy places by the simple process of giving one's note? 'Tis so neat and handy and convenient. Why, pursued my friend, there is Mr. B., my next-door neighbor. 'Tis enough to make one sick of life in the city to spend a week on his farm, such princely living as one gets. And he assures me that it costs him very little, scarce anything perceptible. In fact, indeed, said I, very few people can say that. Why, said my friend, he has a couple of peach trees for every month, from June till frost, that furnish as many peaches as he and his wife and 10 children can dispose of. And then he has grapes, apricots, etc. And last year his wife sold $50 worth from her strawberry patch, and had an abundance for the table besides. Out of the milk of only one cow, they had butter enough to sell 3 or 4 pounds a week, besides abundance of milk and cream, and Madam has the butter for her pocket money. This is the way country people manage. Glorious, thought I, and my wife and I would scarcely sleep all night for the brilliancy of our anticipations. To be sure, our delight was somewhat damped the next day by the coldness from which my good old uncle Jeremiah Standfast, who happened along at precisely this crisis, listened to our visions. You'll find it pleasant, children, in the summer-time, said the hard-fisted old man, twirling his blue-checked pocket handkerchief. I'm sorry that you've gone in debt for the land. Oh, but we shall soon save that. It's so much cheaper living in the country, said both of us together. Well, as to that, I don't think it is, to city-bred folks. Here I broke in with a flood of accounts of Mr. B.'s peach trees, and Mrs. B.'s strawberries, butter, apricots, etc., etc., to which the old gentleman listened with such a long, leathery, unmoved quietude of visage as quite provoked me, and gave me the worst possible opinion of his judgment. I was disappointed, too, for as he was reckoned one of the best practical farmers in the country, I had counted on enthusiastic sympathy with all my agricultural designs. I tell you what, children, he said, a body can live in the country, as you say, amazing cheap, but then a body must know how, and my uncle spread his pocket handkerchief thoughtfully out upon his knees and shook his head gravely. I thought him a terribly slow, stupid old body, and wondered how I had always entertained so high an opinion of his sense. He is evidently getting old, and I to my wife, his judgment is not what it used to be. At all events, our place was bought and moved out, well pleased, the first morning in April, not at all remembering the ill savour of that day for matters of wisdom. Our place was a pretty cottage, about 2 miles from the city, with grounds that had been tastefully laid out. There was no lack of winding paths, arbors, flower borders, and rose bushes, with which my wife was especially pleased. There was a little green lot, strolling off down to a brook, with a thick grove of trees at the end, where our cow was to be pastured. The first week or two went on happily enough in getting our little new pet a house into trimness and good order, for as it had been long for sale, of course there was any amount of little repairs had been left to amuse the leisure hour of the purchaser. Here a doorstep had given way, and indeed replacing, there a shutter hung loose, and wanted a hinge, abundance of grass needed setting, and as to painting and papering, there was no end to that. Then my wife wanted a door cut here, to make our bedroom more convenient, and a china closet knocked up there, where no china closet before had been. We even ventured on throwing out a bay window from our sitting room, because we had luckily lighted on a workman who was so cheap that it was an actual saving of money to employ him. And to be sure, our darling little cottage did lift up its head wonderfully for all this garnishing and furbishing. I got up early every morning and nailed up the rose bushes, and my wife got up and watered geraniums, and both flattered ourselves and each other on our early hours and thrifty habits. But soon, like Adam and Eve in paradise, we found our little domain to ask more hand than ours to get it into shape. So says I to my wife, I'll bring out a gardener when I come next time, and we shall lay the garden out and get it into order, and after that I can easily keep it by the work of my leisure hours. Our gardener was a very sublime sort of man, an Englishman, and of course used to laying out noblemen's places, and we became as grasshoppers in our own eyes when he talked of Lord This and That's estate, and began to question us about our carriage drive and conservatory, and we could with difficulty bring the gentleman down to any understanding of the humble limits of our expectations, merely to dress out the walks and lay out a kitchen garden and plant potatoes, turnips, beets, and carrots was quite a descent for him. In fact, so strong were his aesthetic preferences that he persuaded my wife to let him dig all the turf off the green square opposite the bay window, and to lay out into drivers little triangles resembling small pieces of pie, together with circles, mounds, and various other geometrical ornaments, the planning and planting of which soon engrossed my wife's whole soul. The planting of the potatoes, beets, carrots, etc., was entrusted to a raw Irishman, for as to me, to confess the truth, I began to fear that digging did not agree with me. It is true that I was exceedingly vigorous at first, but actually planted with my own hands 2 or 3 long rows of potatoes, after which I got a turn of rheumatism in my shoulder, which lasted me for a week. Stooping down to plant beets and radishes gave me a vertigo, so that I was obliged to content myself with a general superintendence of the garden. That is to say, I charged my Englishman to see that my Irishman did his duty properly, and then got to my horse and rode to the city. It was about one part of the matter, I must say, I was not remiss, and that is in the purchase of seed and garden utensils. Not a day passed that I did not come home with my pockets stuffed with choice seeds, roots, etc., and the variety of my garden utensils was unequaled. There was not a priming hook of any pattern, not a hoe, rake, or spade, great or small, that I did not have specimens of, and flower seeds and bulbs were also forthcoming in liberal proportions. In fact, I had opened an account at a thriving feed store, for when a man is driving business on a large scale, it is not always convenient to hand out the change for every little matter, and buying things on account is a neat and agreeable mode of acquisition as paying bills with one's notes. You know we must have a cow, said my wife, the morning of our second week. Our friend the gardener, who now worked with us at the rate of $2 a day and for 2 weeks, was at hand in a moment in our emergency. We wanted to buy a cow, and he had one to sell, a wonderful cow of a real English breed. He would not sell her for any money except to oblige particular friends, but as we had patronized him, we should have her $40, how much we were obliged to him. The $40 were speedily forthcoming, and so also was the cow. What makes her shake her head in that way? Said my wife, apprehensively, as she observed the interesting beast making sundry demonstrations with her horns. I hope she's gentle. The gardener fluently demonstrated that the animal was a pattern of all the softer graces, and that the head shaking was merely a little nervous affection, consequent of the embarrassment of a new position. We had faith to believe almost anything at this time, and therefore came from the barnyard to the house, as much satisfied with our own purchase as Job with his 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen. Her quondam master milked her for us the first evening, out of a delicate regard to her feelings as a stranger. We fancied that we discerned $40 worth of excellence in the very quality of milk. But alas, the next morning our Irish girl came in with the most rueful face. And it is milking that baste you'd have me be after. She says sure, and she won't let me come near her. Nonsense, Biddy, said I. You frightened her, perhaps the cow is perfectly gentle. And with the pail on her arm, I sallied forth. The moment Madame saw me entering the cow yard, she greeted me with a very expressive flourish of her horns. This won't do, said I, and I stopped. The lady evidently was serious in her intentions, and resisting any personal approaches, I cut a cudgel, and putting on a bold face, I marched toward her, while Biddy followed with her milking stool. Apparently the beast saw the necessity of temporizing, for she assumed a demure expression, and Biddy sat down to milk. I stood sentry, and the lady shook her own head, and I shook my stick, and thus the milking operation proceeded with tolerable serenity and success. There, said I, with dignity, when the frothing pail was full to the brim. That will do, Biddy, and I dropped my stick. Dump came Madame's heel on the side of the pail, and it flew like a rocket into the air, while the milky flood showered plentifully over me, and a new broadcloth riding coat that I had assumed for the first time that morning. Woo, said I, as soon as I could get my breath from this extraordinary shower bath. What's all this? My wife came running towards the cow yard as I stood with the milk streaming from my hair, filling my eyes and dropping from the tip of my nose, and she and Biddy performed a recitative lamentation over me in alternate strophes, like the chorus of a Greek tragedy. Such was our first morning's experience, but as we had announced our bargain with some considerable flourish of trumpets among our neighbors and friends, we concluded to hush the matter as much as possible. These very superior cows are apt to be cross, said I. We must bear with it, as we do with the eccentricities of genius. Besides, when she gets accustomed to us, it will be better. Madame was therefore installed into her pretty pasture lot, and my wife contemplated with pleasure the picturesque effect of her appearance, reclining on the green slope of the pasture lot, or standing ankle deep in the gurgling brook, or reclining under the deep shadows of the trees. She was, in fact, a handsome cow, which may account, in part, for some of her sins, and this consideration inspired me with some degree of indulgence towards her foibles. But when I found that Biddy could never succeed in getting near her in the pasture, and that any kind of success in the milking operations required my vigorous personal exertions, morning and evening, the matter wore a more serious aspect, and I began to feel pensive and apprehensive. It is very well to talk the pleasures of the milkmaid going out in the balmy freshness of the purple dawn, but imagine a poor fellow pulled out of bed on a drizzly, rainy morning, and equipping himself for a scamper through a wet pasture lot, rope in hand, at the heels of such a termagant as mine. In fact, Madame established a regular series of exercises, which had all to be gone through before she would suffer herself to be captured, as she would station herself plump in the middle of the marsh, which lay at the lower part of the lot, and took very innocent and absent-minded, as if reflecting on some sentimental subject. Suke, 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 I ejaculate, cautiously tottering along the edge of the marsh, and holding out an ear of corn. The lady looks gracious, and comes forward, almost within reach of my hand. I make a plunge to throw the rope over her horns, and away she goes, kicking up mud and water into my face in her flight, while I, losing my balance, tumble forward into the marsh. I pick myself up, and full of wrath, behold her placidity chewing her cud on the other side, and with the meekest air imaginable, as who should say, I hope you are not hurt, sir. I dash through swamp and bog furiously, resolving to carry all but a coup de main. Then follows a miscellaneous season of dodging, scampering, and bow-keeping among the trees of the grove, interspersed with sundry occasional races across the bog aforesaid. I always wondered how I caught her every day, and when I tied her head to one post and her heels to another, I wiped the sweat from my brow, and I thought I was paying dear for the eccentricities of genius. A genius she certainly was, for besides her surprising agility, she had other talents equally extraordinary. There was no fence that she could not take down, nowhere that she could not go. She took the pickets off the garden fence at her pleasure, using her horns as handily as I could use the claw hammer. Whatever she had a mind to, whether it was a bite in the cabbage garden, or a run in the corn patch, or a foraging expedition into the flower borders, she made herself equally welcome and at home. Such a scampering and driving, such cries of "Suke here" and "Suke there," as constantly greeted our ears, kept our little establishment in a constant commotion. At last, when she one morning made a splunge at the skirts of my new broadcloth frock-coat, and carried off one flap on her horns, my patience gave out, and I determined to sell her. As, however, I made a good story of my misfortunes among my friends and neighbors, and amused them with sundry whimsical accounts of my various adventures of the cow-catching line, I found, when I came to speak of selling, that there was a general coolness on the subject, and nobody seemed disposed to be the recipient of my responsibilities. In short, I was glad at last to get $15 for her, and comforted myself with thinking that I had at least gained $25 worth of experience in the transaction, to say nothing of the fine exercise. I comforted my soul, however, the day after, by purchasing and bringing home to my wife a fine swarm of bees. Your bee, now, says I, is a real classical insect, and breathed Virgil and Augustine age, and then she is a domestic, tranquil, placid creature. How beautiful and murmuring of a hive near our honeysuckle of a calm summer evening. Then they are tranquilly and peacefully amassing for us their stores of sweetness, while they lull us with their murmurs. What a beautiful image of disinterested benevolence! My wife declared that I was quite a poet, and the beehive was duly installed near the flower pots, and the delicate creatures might have the benefit of the honeysuckle and the mignonette. My spirits began to rise. I bought 3 different treatises on the rearing of bees, and also 1 or 2 new patterns of hives, and proposed to rear my bees on the most approved model. I charged all the establishment to let me know, when there was any indication of an emigrating spirit, that I might be ready to receive the new swarm into my patent mansion. Accordingly, one afternoon, when I was deep in an article that I was preparing for the American Review, intelligence was brought me that a swarm had risen. I was on the alert at once, and discovered, on going out, that the provoking creatures had chosen the top of a tree about 30 feet high to settle on. Now my books had carefully instructed me just how to approach the swarm and cover them with a new hive, but I never contemplated the possibility of a swarm being, like Haman's gallows, 40 cubits high. I looked despairingly upon the smooth bar tree, which rose like a column, full 20 feet, without branch or twig. What is to be done? Said I, appealing to 2 or 3 neighbors. At last, at the recommendation of one of them, a ladder was raised against the tree, and equipped with a shirt outside of my clothes, a green veil over my head, and a pair of leather gloves on my hands, I went up and saw at my girdle to saw off the branch on which they had settled, to lower it by a rope to a neighbor, similarly equipped, who stood below with the hive. As a result of this maneuver, the fastidious little insects were at length fairly installed at housekeeping in my new patent hive, and rejoicing in my success, I again sat down to my article. That evening my wife and I took tea in our honeysuckle arbor with little ones and a friend or two, to whom I showed my treasures and expatiated at large on the comforts and conveniences of the new patent hive. But alas for the hopes of man, the little ungrateful wretches! What must they do but take advantage of my oversleeping myself the next morning to clear out for new quarters, without so much as leaving me a PPC. Such was the fact. At 8 o'clock I found the new patent hive as good as ever. But the bees I have never seen before that day due to this. The rascally little conservatives, said I. I believe they have never had a new idea from the days of Virgil down. They are entirely unprepared to appreciate improvements. Meanwhile, the seeds began to germinate in our garden, when we found, to our chagrin, that between John Bull and Patty there had occurred sundry confusions in the several departments. Radishes had been planted broadcast, carrots and beets arranged in hills, and here and there where a whole paper of seed appeared to have been planted bodily. My good old uncle, who, somewhat to my confusion, made me a call at this time, was greatly distressed and scandalized by the appearance of our garden, but by a deal of fussing and transplanting and replanting it was got into some shape and order. My uncle was rather troublesome, as careful old people are apt to be, annoying us by perpetual inquiries of what we gave for this and that, and running up provoking calculations on the final cost of matters, and we began to wish that his visits might be as short as would be convenient. But when on taking leave he promised to send us a fine young cow for his own raising, our hearts rather smote us for our impatience. "'Tain't any of your new breeds, nephew," said the old man. Yet I can say that she's a gentle, likely young critter, and better worth $40 than many of one that's cried up for Ayrshire or Durham. And you shall be quite welcome to her. We thanked him as in duty bound, and thought that if he was full of old-fashioned notions, he was no less full of kindness and goodwill. And now, with a new cow, with our garden beginning to thrive under the gentle showers of May, with our flower borders blooming, my wife and I began to think ourselves in paradise. But alas, the same sun and rain that warmed our fruit and flowers brought up from the earth, like sulky gnomes, a vast array of purple-leaved weeds that almost in the night seemed to cover the whole surface of the garden beds. Our gardeners both being gone, the weeding was expected to be done by me, one of the anticipated relaxations of my leisure hours. "Well," said I, in reply to the gentle invitation from my wife, "when my article is finished, I'll take a day and weed all up clean." Thus days slipped by, till at length the article was dispatched, and I proceeded to my garden. Amazement! Who could have possibly foreseen that anything earthly could grow as fast in a few days? There were no bounds, no alleys, no beds, no distinction of beet and carrot, nothing but a flourishing congregation of weeds nodding and bobbing in the morning breeze, as if to say, "We hope you are well, sir. We've got the ground, you see. I begin to explore, and to hoe, and to weed. Ah, did anybody ever try to clean a neglected carrot or beet bed, or bend his back in the hot sun over rows of weedy onions? He is the man to feel for my despair, how I weeded and sweat and sighed, till when high noon came on, as a result of all my toils, only 3 beds were cleaned, and how disconsolate I looked the good seed, thus unexpectedly delivered from its sheltering tares, and laid open to a broiling July sun. Every juvenile beet and carrot lay flat down, wilted and drooping, as if, like me, they had been weeding instead of being weeded. "This weeding is quite a serious matter," said I to my wife. "The fact is I must have help about it." "Just what I was myself thinking," said my wife. "My flower borders are all in confusion, and my petunia mounds so completely overgrown, and nobody would dream that what they were meant for. In short, it was agreed between us that we could not afford the expense of a full-grown man to keep our place. Yet we must reinforce ourselves by the addition of a boy, and a brisk youngster from the vicinity was pitched upon us as the happy addition. This youth was a fellow of decidedly quick parts, and in one forenoon made such a clearing of our garden that I was delighted. Bed after bed appeared to view, all cleared and dressed out, with such celerity that I was quite ashamed of my own slowness, until on examination I discovered that he had, with great impartiality, pulled up both weeds and vegetables. This hopeful beginning was followed up by a succession of proceedings which should be recorded for the instruction of all who seek for help from the race of boys. Such a loser of all tools, great and small, such an invariable lever open of all gates, and letter down of bars, such a personification of all manner of anarchy and ill luck, had never before been seen on the estate. His time, while I was gone to the city, was agreeably diversified with roosting on the fence, swinging on the gates, making poplar whistles for the children, hunting eggs, and eating whatever fruit happened to be in season, in which later accomplishment he was certainly quite distinguished. After about 3 weeks of this kind of joint gardening, we concluded to dismiss Master Tom from the firm, and employ a man. Things must be taken care of, said I, and I cannot do it. It is out of the question. And so the man was secured. But I am making a long story, and may chance to outrun the sympathies of my readers. Time would fail me to tell me the distresses that manifold that fell upon me, of cows dried up by poor milkers, of hens that wouldn't set at all, and hens that, despite all law and reason, would set on one egg, and hens that, having hatched families, straightway led them into all manner of high grass and weeds, by which means numerous young chicks caught premature colds and perished, and how when I, with manifest toil, had driven one of these inconsiderate gadders into a coop, to teach her domestic habits, the rats came down upon her and slew every chick in one night. How my pigs were always practicing gymnastic exercises over the fence of the sty, and rotting in the garden. I wonder that Fourier never conceived the idea of having his garden land plowed by pigs, for certainly they manifest quite a decided elective attraction for turning up the earth. When autumn came, I went soberly to market in the neighboring city, and bought up my potatoes and turnips like any other man, for between all the various systems of gardening pursued, I was obliged to confess that my first horticultural effort was a decided failure. But though all my rural visions had proved elusive, there were some very substantial realities. My bill at the seed store for seeds, roots, and tools, for example, had run up to an amount that was perfectly unaccountable. Then there are various smaller items, such as horseshoeing, carriage mending, for he who lives in the country, does business in the city, must keep his vehicle and appurtenances. I had always prided myself on being an exact man, and settling every account, great and small, with the going out of the old year, but this season I found myself sorely put to it. In fact, had not I received timely lift from my good old uncle, I should have made a complete breakdown. The old gentleman's troublesome habit of ciphering and calculating, it seemed, had led him beforehand to foresee that I was not exactly in the money-making line, nor likely to possess much surplus revenue to meet the note which I had given for my place, and therefore he quietly paid it himself. And I discovered, when, after much anxiety and some sleepless nights, I went to the holder to ask for an extension of credit. He was right, after all, said I to my wife. To live cheaply in the country, a body must know how. And that's the end of A Scholar's Adventures in the Country by Harriet Beecher Stowe. I like the story. Sometimes it's harder to start a farm than you might think it is. Sometimes if you're not finding cash crops to sell, if you're working on just growing food to eat, it's kind of a waste of time, because you're going to find that other people are actually able to grow the foods better than you can, And it's actually better to pay to buy other people's foods rather than to grow your own. Unless you're an expert at growing foods, then you could do that, or you can learn to be an expert. It could be a hobby, but gardening can be an expensive hobby. It's a fun hobby, but it's also an expensive hobby, and it's a lot of hassle and it's a lot of stuff you got to do. But it's something to do. It's a way to pass the time. You have to find something to fill up your life to do, and gardening is just one of the things you can do. Let me know in the comments below what you think of the story. Please subscribe to this channel to be part of the community. And please like this video. It really helps the channel out a lot. Thank you for watching. Have a great day. Bye-bye.